Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's seminar. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll mention just a few of our talks coming up on Friday slots for the coming few weeks. Next week, we don't have a talk, but we have the Conservation Optimism Film Festival. So it's a series of short films around nature and optimism that were based on a festival last summer, and then we'll be showing them in here. And there are 10-minute films each. So it's quite a nice hour and a half to come and watch these films. I do recommend you come along. And the quality is incredible for these winning films. Okay, and then the week after we have our own Sofasdu Omegassen, who's going to be talking about making nature markets work in the 21st century. Evidence from Finland, Australia, and the EU. England, Australia, and the EU, I should say. And then the week after, we've got Laura Pereira from Wits University in South Africa on why we need to imagine more transformative scenarios for people and nature. And she comes with a very particular Afrofuturism perspective, an African perspective on transformative scenarios for nature. And the week after, we have Nicola Ranger on reimagining Bretton Woods, placing nature at the heart of global finance and governance. So an interesting range of talks coming up in the next few weeks. And there's lots more. If you look online, there's another 4 more talks before the end of term as well, but I'll leave things there. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I should also mention that we have drinks after the questions. We have drinks around the corner, so feel free to linger and have a more informal conversation. So our speaker today is Tom Oliver, who's a Professor of Applied Ecology and an Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and the Environment at the University of Reading. He has advised DEFRA in the UK government on a variety of capacities, helping them set up a systems research program. And he sits on the Food Standards Agency Science Council and the Office for Environmental Protection. And he regularly advises the European Commission and the European Environment Agency Scientific Committee. And he's written quite a lot in the press and Guardian, Independent, BBC Science. And a few years ago, he wrote a book called The Self-Delusion, The Surprising Science of Our Connection to Each Other and the Natural World. And I just heard there's another book on the way that follows up on those concepts. So it's great to have you here, Tom, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's a real honor to be able to come and speak to you today. So yeah, you've seen the title here. What I'm going to do is start off with a thought experiment. It's it's Friday afternoon. It's been a busy week. Maybe just think in a slightly different way for a moment. So I just want you to take a moment, and you can look down or close your eyes, but I just want you to think what the future could be like in 2100. Okay, so if you had let's say you had a child who's 5 or 10 years old, they're going to be about early 80s by then. So just try and imagine what will the changes be like? What would it feel like to be alive at that time? Okay, and then we're going to come back to this question at the end. That's okay. So, but first, a bit of doom and gloom. I'm not going to spend too long about this. I mean, you're all familiar with what some people call the polycrisis, and yeah, whether this is ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, deforestation, zoonotic diseases, climate change, extreme weather events, disruption of the nitrogen cycle, all these impacts that we're having on the planet. And of course, those impacts cascade, interact with each other to cause social change processes, food insecurity, mass human displacement, financial crises. And because they're all linked, people often talk about this as a polycrisis, that we can't, look at each of these topics separately. We need to see this as one, mega crisis and think about how we deal with that. So obviously that's quite a daunting framing. So I spent my first years, I suppose, after my PhD working in more traditional ecology. So, and to be honest, I kind of started to feel like I was just articulating the decline of nature in ever more sort of nuanced ways. And that's great, to produce papers if you want to, move up the kind of career ladder in academia. And I didn't want to go into business when I was younger. I wanted to go into academia But actually, then I realized quite quickly there is a whole kind of rat race in academia as well. And if you're not careful, you can just spend your time trying to get papers in high impact journals and the next grant without really thinking about why we're doing things or how we can actually affect change with our research. So I did become a little bit disillusioned with this approach. And even when I was doing some applied ecology experiments, so my role at the moment is Professor of Applied Ecology at Reading. This is, for example, a field margin, quite a wide field margin, where we're trying to put flowers for birds and insects. And at the end, there's a triangle, which is more host plants for butterflies. And we were trying to see if we could allow butterflies to move across this landscape. This is important down in Wiltshire. But really, this actually is, working on field margins and actually, tinkering at the margins of a bigger problem, which is that our food system looks, our landscapes in the UK look often like this. 70% of our land is arable or improved grassland in England, essentially a biodiversity desert. We've got 1.1% of our neutral and or calcareous grassland left. So really, I literally went to whole workshops working out, well, if we had these little bits of field margins, how could we configure them in a way which, butterflies might be able to move across landscapes? But, really, it's not going to work because of that. And, it's not just what's on that land. There's, pesticides, chemical fertilizers that leach out, aerial deposition of nitrogen that affects the natural habitats as well, that are very fragmented. So really, I became interested in how we start to think about changing that food system so that it's not destroying nature. And that's a very different type of work that doesn't, moves you away from the kind of maybe traditional ecology. So this is the framing. Is there a way, the slides are sort of sticking out the end a bit or not? If not, it doesn't matter, I guess. I think you can probably mostly read them. I wouldn't. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, don't worry, that's fine. So, this is the frame of the polycrisis, that nature destruction results from, the dominant economic paradigm and socio-political systems in the modern economy. And that's entrenched in institutional factors, economic regulations, legislation, finance, tax systems. And they incentivize and promote this consumption models that drive the destruction of nature. So this is a fairly, reasonably deep analysis. So often when we're faced with something like that, we might think about trying to, achieve our societal goals by transforming the economy or technological fixes. And really, what I want to focus on today is about trying to go a little bit deeper and look at the culture as well. Because if we just work only on the outer level of this kind of circle, we're essentially kind of scratching the surface. And even trying to change the economy, you actually need to change the way the economy works, the rules of the economy. And that's partly, really about changing our institutions, changing our culture. So this is about trying to say it's not all about culture, but we can't ignore culture. We need to focus on that as part of a series of interventions. And actually, one of the issues is if we focus on just those outer layers, sometimes it's not only we can be ineffective in our attempts to avert environmental crisis, we can sometimes even make things worse. So I'm just going to go through now and give a few examples of where I think some of the pitfalls of, say, a very narrow kind of blinkered focus on economic fixes. So, well, firstly, we used to try to conserve nature by talking about how beautiful it was, the charismatic species, umbrella species we called them, that if we can protect the tiger or the whale or the panda, the Save the Whale campaign, Save the Panda, then we could protect other species. And actually, whether that was successful or not, it may have slowed the decline of nature, but it didn't really work. We've still got precipitous biodiversity declines around the world. So, people said we need to be more pragmatic. This is about now the business of nature. This is the new paradigm that we're gonna take. We're gonna quantify the value of nature. We're even going to monetize it, and we're going to integrate it into the economic system so that we're not externalizing all those impacts and destroying our soils, destroying our wildlife, poisoning the air. We're going to integrate that into our business operations. But, there are some you know, that's framed in a pragmatic way. You know, you're being very idealistic, thinking we can just focus on charismatic species. Let's get real. Let's get pragmatic about the business of biodiversity. But actually, thinking about it, there are maybe 8 million species on the planet. You know, people disagree at order of magnitude how many, but let's say there are that many. But we've only named about 2 million, right? So that's only naming them, let alone knowing what they do in terms of their role in soil, you know, carbon cycling, their role in purifying water, their cultural values. And even where we have started to quantify those values, those functions, ecosystem functions, they change. You know, what might not be an important pollinator now in the UK, in 10 years when we have a much drier climate, might actually be an important pollinator. So the roles are context dependent as well. So suddenly it doesn't seem so, you know, it seems a bit more idealistic thinking that we can quantify all the functions of species and integrate them somehow into the economic system. Now, that said, I'm not saying there isn't any role in taking an economic approach to protecting biodiversity. Talking about payment for ecosystem services, so the top left pilots, there's some good successes where in a catchment, for example, you might want to clean the water, and rather than water companies paying to purify the water using physical and chemical means, you might be able to put an auction in the catchment and pay a landowner or a farmer to, you know, restore some wetland and improve water quality that way, which has co-benefits for nature. So there's lots of examples where this kind of thing can work. I guess where I'd be a bit cautious is where you're opening up those markets to, you know, an open market. There's a project here by your very own University of Oxford, Martin School, called Nature Trade. And this to me strikes fear into my heart, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. You can click on the link and it's described as creating an eBay for ecosystem services. So the idea is that ecologists will go to landowners or farmers and say, here's what you've got on your land in terms of how the different ecosystem services of water, you know, improving water quality, storing soil carbon, protecting biodiversity. We'll help you write a contract so you can get paid for these things. Now, to me, that's a little bit worrying if you may crowd out social norms by paying for things. So let me just unpack that a little bit. When you pay someone to do something, it becomes a transactional relationship. And there's a danger that you start paying them and then they stop doing it for the right reason. Okay, that would be crowding out of social norms. I'll just give you might be familiar with this. I'm sorry if it's a bit of a hackneyed example, but there was some behavioral psychologists looked at nurseries and that parents were picking up their kids late from nursery. And so it was a problem for the staff. So they said, well, let's put a charge. If you pick up your child late, you get charged. You have to pay a fee. And actually what happened is parents got later. Because what they realized, rather than feeling like I'm putting the childminder out by turning up late, you know, you've got a social obligation, it's the right thing to do. You're suddenly saying, if you're a rich parent, you can say, I can afford that. I'll just go even later. So what has happened is the social norm is crowded out by the transactional instrumental payments. It might work the other way, where you crowd in social norms. So imagine you've got a landowner who doesn't really know about protecting wildlife, doesn't really care. You start paying them to create these field margins, lots of beautiful butterflies, you know, orange tips, hair streaks. The landowner likes them, and then you stop paying for them to plant the margins, and you know, they decide that they'd like to keep them. They'd like to do them anyway, to have these margins anyway. So you've now crowded in a social norm. So it's important, if paying people to do things on land, paying for ecosystem services, crowds in or crowds out social norms. At the time that this project was funded, it was mixed evidence. This paper is slightly on the balance that we may crowd out social norms by starting to pay for things. So to me, that's very worrying, because this project is funded by Life Plus funding, which normally is like big conservation funding, not really for research. It should be for doing on the ground conservation, restoring a wetland, planting a forest. So to employ it in a scheme which is starting to say, we're going to take these contracts to landowners and we're going to start paying them, you know, to me is a little bit worrying, because you might actually be doing the exact opposite of what you want. So I'm not saying this is a bad project. I'm just saying we need to be very cautious about our approach to creating these big open markets for nature. And just to give one more economic example, this is about biodiversity net gain. So many of you may be familiar with this now, that the idea is that we pay, sorry, not pay. If a developer wants to build some houses, we say, okay, you're going to destroy biodiversity on those land, but you can either restore it, in the local landscape, and you have to create net gain. So you have to create at least 10 or even 20% improvement in biodiversity. So the idea is that if all these things are happening across the landscape, biodiversity is going up. So that's great. This is just a case study that I got involved in, just to sort of pro bono advice. And I was just interested to know how these calculations work. So it was called Scotland Park. It was in Hazelmere in Surrey. And you can see it's the area here. It was secondary woodland. It wasn't ancient woodland, but it had quite a few different, birds and bats and some reptiles in there. And all the red and white area was going to be converted into either a paved area or urban gardens. And the argument was that this is going to be net gain. It's going to be 20% net gain. And what they were doing was a few measures on site. And then these areas here, it's not new woodland. So this bit here is they were going to look at this woodland, and they said it's poor condition, and they're going to somehow make it moderate condition. But to be honest, you don't really need to do much. What they talked about was allowing the trees to mature. So it's just like allowing the trees to grow. So, I mean, basically, there's a lot of issues with this. You've got to go into the details and understand the nuance. But what I worked out is that a lot hinges on whether that woodland is poor quality, and the bits of things they do on site don't have much effect. So is this really poor quality? Oh, sorry, the woodland that they're going to destroy and build all the houses on, is it poor quality or is it moderate? So the way you know that is you add up scores. There are a number of points that you say, well, has it got these a mixture of species diversity? Are there any signs of pests and diseases, or rhododendron, which is an invasive species? Is it present? These are quite subjective questions. Is it present? So it could be a seedling, or it could be a whole stand. And if I was there and it was a seedling, I might say, well, it's not anymore because I pulled it up, But if it's a big stand, obviously. So it's very subjective. If I wanted to score, the score to be a bit lower, I could probably tweak it a little bit. And if I wanted to be a bit higher, you could probably tweak it. So the person who's doing this score, or the people, are ecological consultants. They're paid by the developer. So you can see the incentive system of them probably not wanting to give the wrong number, because they want the contract for next year. So it turned out that what the difference between scoring these woodlands as moderate or poor was 1 point in difference. I think I can't remember if it's 26 or something like that. That's the threshold. And if any of these subjective questions you'd score differently, the whole woodland would have been moderate instead of poor. And so what would have been 20% net gain would have been 40% net loss. Right? So that's how the subjective criterion leads to such a big difference. And so I'm not saying biodiversity net gain is a bad scheme, because we need some scheme. But what I'm saying is it's important. No algorithm is going to give you the right answer unless you have the right training and also the right values underpinning this, both in the ecological consultants, in the councils, in the developers, and you don't have skewed incentives. So it's a bit like, you have to get the rules right, but you need more than rules to run a society. It's a bit like saying, I've got a society full of psychopaths, but we've just got the right police and the right rules, so it's going to work. But it's clearly not, going to work. So, you need this bedrock of pro-social values for civilization to work. And we need a bedrock of pro-environmental values for these type of schemes to work. We can't just have a casual attitude to ecocide and then expect that these things are going to restore biodiversity. So again, I've got to be cautious with this message. I'm not anti-economic fix, and I'm not anti-techno fix. So this is the next item I wanted to come on to. So technological fixes, very popular because often they require innovation. They probably increase GDP. We face a climate crisis. There's no doubt about that. There's lots of wild and wacky ways of trying to stop the planet warming. We can put iron filings in the sea and stimulate the growth of phytoplankton. We can fly planes and put out vapor or crystals that whiten the clouds and increase the reflective levels. We can put mirrors in space. Now, these are quite dangerous options because they're likely to lead to unanticipated effects. You know, you change the weather in one place and it will no doubt have an effect elsewhere. And, you know, you may disrupt entire seasonal patterns in certain countries and create massive food insecurity in other countries by doing these kind of things. So many countries have been rightly worried about geoengineering as an approach. The US has been pushing it recently with strong support for experimentation. Other countries, I think Switzerland and Japan, for example, but many other countries want a ban. And at the last United Nations forum this year, there was not really agreement on whether there should be a ban or research. And by research, it's not just paper research, it's trialing these things. But what's a real danger is when you start doing the research, there are companies that want to make money and can lobby and push for further application. So you have to be careful about opening the doors as these being, you know, credible solutions. You know, they treat the Earth, you know, as one big kind of, us all as one big guinea pig in terms of trying some of these things out potentially. So, you know, we've got to be careful. The other thing about Technfixes, which is more subtle, is they have opportunity costs. So if I'm pursuing a Technfix, it means I don't necessarily need to solve the problem right now. So let's say there's a there is a pollinator crisis. We're losing lots of bumblebees, hoverflies, solitary bees. People invent robotic bees, you know, drones that literally fly around and can pollinate greenhouses. These exist and they're being developed very quickly, but they are in no way going to maintain the pollination services of all wildflowers. And so if we just focus on, you know, in greenhouses, pollinating crops, there's an opportunity cost potentially in protecting wild pollinators, and we may get a massive loss of our wildflowers and our wild pollinators outside those greenhouses. So we have to be careful with the opportunity costs of some of these Technfixes. And this is a really nice book if you're interested at the kind of the deeper psychological level as to why we pursue these Technfixes and why they're so, you know, attractive. And all my slides have got a little bit wonky here, but this is saying the pitfalls of top-down regulation. So sometimes this is around economic fixes. You know, the yellow vest protests in France were the French government putting in place a tax on fuel, arguably to reduce carbon emissions of the country, but actually it wasn't done in a way which is appreciating the cost of living or impacts on many people. And there were huge riots and deaths. The farmer protests this year all around Europe were based on Green Deal legislation in the EU trying to, you know, ban certain pesticides or reduce fertilizer use and force farmers to create areas of biodiversity-rich habitat. All great things to do, but if they're imposed top-down, then they're not necessarily going to work. So this idea of, you know, the union saying nothing about us without us, you know, we cannot impose sustainability in a top-down way. So I guess this is just another element of this command and control approach to protecting the environment that we need to be quite cautious about. So coming back to this diagram, you know, I've talked about some of the risks of just working at those surface layers, and I wanted to kind of focus on what are the other ways we need to do things as well. So we've talked about the food crisis, the impacts of our global food system on nature and on the climate. And many science policy agencies have talked about the need for a food system transformation. No one disagrees on that. The question is how we do that. So I was involved in when I first went to Reading in 2015, and the reason I went there from an environmental research agency called Centre for Ecology and Hydrology was I wanted to do more interdisciplinary science. So I led this workshop where we got together people from the business school, from development, from agriculture, from psychology, and ecology and various other disciplines. And we asked, what are the mechanisms that prevent us transforming the food system? And we didn't say these are exhaustive, but we just wanted to point out that there are lots of different mechanisms, and some are around knowledge constraints. So let's say a retailer wants to put green labeling on their food. So people can choose what they buy in a more, you know, sensible way. But actually, there's no. It's very difficult to understand what the embedded water is, embedded carbon, biodiversity impact of a product, let alone a product with 50 different ingredients in. So yeah, this is a knowledge constraint. And often in academia, we work on knowledge constraints, this information deficit model. We provide the information, we give it someone, the world will get better. you know, there are knowledge constraints. I'm not denying that, but they're only part of the problem. Sometimes the problem is we're doing the wrong things economically. So, for example, we pay farmers, we have paid farmers to farm in a way that produces lots of food post World War II. And actually, what's those perverse subsidies have led to, and paying people to just keep land in a farmable state, which actually means not allowing scrub to grow, and scrub is great for wildlife. So, you know, we're paying farmers to do things which are bad for nature. So that's a problem. And then just jumping across to the last side, what we're calling biophysical constraints here. These are things like pesticide lock-ins. Like we might want to farm in a way which doesn't use pesticides, but actually we've destroyed all our spiders and our ladybirds from those landscapes. So we actually need to restore those before it's viable to farm in a way that doesn't rely on these intensive chemical inputs. So we're almost locked in now in many places to using them. So that's a problem. But the one I want to focus on more today, and I think arguably this is the one that's most neglected. And I spent, as Yadvinda said, a couple of years in DEFRA, and you know they do a lot on economic and regulatory constraints in DEFRA. And in academia, we do a lot of knowledge constraints. And DEFRA do have a social sciences unit, but they're not really very prominent, or they're not the first people they go to around a question. And yet this is a huge set of constraints that prevent transformation in the food system. So I've talked about belief in technofixes. If you think you can just innovate and invent robotic pollinators, how am I going to convince you that we need to act now to restore wild pollinator populations? So that's a problem. Another one is about limited collective identity. I just came from a workshop today in Windsor about feeding, what was it called? Feeding the UK, avoiding the inevitable. And we talked about some of the lock-in mechanisms. And actually this one came up as a big one about how the very highly competitive system where, companies are fighting against each other, consumers see themselves as isolated, entities with not really much agency or citizenship to be able to influence the food system. And we lack a lot of collective identity, which, empowers people to create change. So there are a whole set of these mechanisms. And the point I wanted to make is just they're neglected. So this framing, I don't know if people are familiar with this, leverage points framing is quite helpful, I think. This is Daniela Meadows, and she was a kind of seminal systems thinker. And she came up with this idea of these different leverage points. And, you can tweak things in a system. You can put a little tax on something, or you can, put a small regulation in, or you can really change the rules of the system, and you can change the mindsets. What is a university for, right? What is it just getting money off students and teaching them the syllabus, or is it creating disruptors who are going to change the world for better? They're two different framings of what a university is, and they lead to very different outcomes in how you might run a university and how you run a food system or how you run a government. So this is hugely powerful for transforming systems, but it's obviously hard to do because you've got to really understand how people see their system, what it's for, and how you can influence them in how they, how you can change their view if you feel the system is running in a way which is bad for nature or bad for people, driving inequality, driving climate change. Another way of looking at this is the iceberg model, where you have events like a food price shock. What's behind that? We say, oh, it's an extreme weather event, or it was a ship that blocked the Panama Canal, whatever. But then there is a whole set of underlying factors under here that have created the configuration of that food system. And those are essentially the mindsets and culture that underpin the institution. So this is not my diagram, but a slightly sort of technical way of showing this iceberg, which I did quite like, because if you look in the middle, you can see, you've got the events in the world, and then you've got the patterns and the systemic structures. And at the bottom, you've got the mental models, as I talked about. And they talk on the right-hand side, which not helpfully you can't see. I'm going to read out. So if you're just working at the top surface level, you're doing things like you're ignoring things, or you're fixing the symptom just above the water. You're adjusting or you're adapting. So you're really just trying to set, it's very reactive. It's like, oh, this has happened. Oh, we better do this. Oh, this has happened. We better do this. You're not really fixing the systemic risks that are happening, that are driving all these things impacting you. So the root causes of those systemic risks. But if you try and get a bit deeper, you're looking at, the middle part. You're trying to change those systemic structures. You're restructuring, you're redesigning your system. And if you go right down to the bottom, you're reframing and relearning what a system is for. So you're really trying to get at how these things work. So we're kind of shifting from environmental science to a bit of philosophy now, I suppose, or or psychology, perhaps cognitive psychology. I'm asking, is there some kind of myopia, some kind of blindness that's causing this superficial solutionism? Why are we always focusing on these economic fixes, these technological fixes, and we don't really go down to the deeper level? So do we have this blinkered thinking based on an unquestioned underlying beliefs and a learned cognitive style? It's a bit of a wordy question, that. It's kind of rhetorical, because of course we do. If you think about it, we know about cognitive biases. There are many of them. There are ways that, people make mistakes in the way they think in different ways, and everyone is slightly different. And so, of course, we don't see the whole picture in the way we think. So really, the question is, can we think a little bit differently? So I apologize in advance. This is probably the most sort of technical slide. This is an attempt of sort of capturing what systems thinking is. So really, I'm going to sort of take you through the diagram. So in the middle, you've got multiple desired outcomes. This is saying you don't just want to focus on one thing at a time. Let's focus on net zero. But it turns out by doing that, you plant lots of maize bioenergy crops, and you damage water quality, and you destroy biodiversity. That's not great. So you're trying to avoid those trade-offs by thinking about multiple outcomes at the same time. You're trying to think about multiple timescales, not just how to get benefits this year, but how to protect things for future generations. And you're thinking about large spatial scales. But equally, what you're doing with systems approaches is, of course, there are different systems involved, subsystems, economics, policy, legal systems, that if you want to create change in the world, you need to work on those. But in particular, which is the little eyes, and on the top right, the focus here, is that there are different ways of seeing the world. There are different perspectives, there are different value sets, different judgments. And systems approaches about understanding those so you can kind of navigate a problem. So at the bottom, it's talking about systems approaches are kind of natural sciences techniques like agent-based models or statistics process, different types of process models. But there are also a whole range of sort of social sciences techniques to really understand and kind of surface these different perspectives that people have. And interestingly, systems thinking, and we kind of reviewed this in a DEFRA report, but there's a whole other field called organizational wisdom, which is actually quite similar. So systems thinking is not one discipline. I guess you could say it's a confluence of different disciplines that's coming together from, cybernetics in biology, from various, critical thinking, social sciences, and etc. But organizational wisdom, if you read some of these, I'll start at number 2, using judgment that accommodates multiple realities and weighs the interest of multiple stakeholders, taking into account wider social and ethical considerations, and exercising wisdom, that's a good word, wisdom in decision-making and the implementation of decisions. And so this is really in a similar vein of systems thinking. And it's about really seeing those different perspectives and getting at how we view a system and what it's for. So this is crucially important for creating that deeper change in our institutions. So that was quite a technical slide. It's probably nice just to have a rest and look at some pretty flowers. And maybe I'll read this T.S. Eliot quote saying, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information?" And we could go further. Where's the information we've lost in data? And we jump so much nowadays to the data. Where's the data? Let's crunch the data. But actually, what's it telling us? What's it for? What's the system for? Is where we integrate those perspectives and that wisdom thinking. And I don't think, arguably, we do that enough. And maybe that's because often we sit in departments of universities that are siloed in the way they do things. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper now into this myopia. Why do we maybe have this superficial solutionism I talked about? And let's maybe transport ourselves back in time to the dusty streets of ancient Greece. And outside the walls of Athens, there's a shady grove of olive trees, and you can hear noises of enthusiastic participants engaged in a debate. And the voice you can hear is their leader, Plato, and this is his academy. And one of his students is Aristotle, who will study with Plato for 20 years before he sets off on adventures on his own. And Aristotle travels across Greece and Turkey. Incidentally, on the way, he trains Alexander the Great, who runs off and conquers vast swathes of Persia. But Aristotle has his own impact in a much more quiet way, because he studies animals and plants across the continent, and he starts to put these together and creates systems of identification and categorization. And this was the first development of a kind of modern logic system of categorizing different objects and how they relate to each other. Okay. And moving forward, that type of logic of how we can group different types of objects and how they interact with each other in different rules was the kind of progenitor of our modern science. And obviously that led to great innovations. And we had mathematicians like Laplace, who was talking about how the world is essentially made of these different objects, and if we can understand what those objects are and how their motions, we can make predictions. And that mechanistic view of understanding was taken further by people like Rene Descartes, philosopher, who then likened animals to kind of clockwork machines, and that led to actually, down the line, huge aspects of animal cruelty. Also, he talked about how humans, though, our minds are different. We are divine, even though we have these kind of mechanical, bodies that are just made of atoms, this material bodies. And this anthropocentrism, where we see humans as different and separate from everything else, building from this reductionist approach, really kind of developed and has actually, through that Enlightenment period, and has really structured the way we think today. So just looking at environmental conservation, for example, we have a really anthropocentric lens by which we view nature. And sorry, you can't see the stats here, but about 45% of reports take this anthropocentric perspective, and only 10% really take a kind of bio or ecocentric worldview, where you're coming from a kind of the intrinsic value of nature. So anthropocentric here being, nature is there for us. It's an asset. As Partha Dasgupta said in the review, nature is therefore an asset, just as produced capital and human capital are assets. Now, he actually, in that review, talks about how we're part of nature and a kind of deeper ecological approach, but actually it's very sort of hidden away in the review is called The Economics of Biodiversity. And many of our reports, have that outward-facing anthropocentric approach, where nature is there for us, for humans. You'll probably be familiar with the ecosystem services perspective, where nature does things that provide benefits for humans. And this was the approach that was used, or the lens that was taken in the first assessment, the first global assessment of biodiversity conducted by IPBES, Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they wanted to, a bit like the IPCC for climate, involve all different member countries of the UN. So 132 member states. And when they got these people together, scientists from, tens of countries, over 100 countries, many rejected that framing. They see human and non-human entities interwoven in deep relationships of kinship and reciprocal obligation. Okay, so they don't buy that nature is there, an asset, something separate, just to provide benefits to us. And in their, in their favor, the IPBES Secretariat didn't plow on. They didn't kind of pursue what you might call epistemic colonialism, which says our worldview is right. Sorry, we're just listening to you, but we're going to plow on. They took a step back and they conducted a whole new assessment called the IPBES Values Assessment, where they started to understand how different peoples see nature. So whether it's the Quechua, Inuit, Maori, Aimawa, Nguni Bantu tribes people, of course, there's a whole diverse set of ways that these people see nature. But one thing that's actually common is they see nature as an ancestor, and that humans are embedded and part of that kind of great tapestry. Don't see humans as something separate or nature as something that's for humans. And actually, this paper is quite interesting because it shows that the experts that were involved in the assessment, even the ones from a more Western mindset, started to change their way of thinking as they were exposed to these different worldviews. So why does this matter? Because the way we see ourselves in relation to nature affects what we do. So if you answer this question, what best describes your relationship with nature? Just have a think now where you would put yourself. Because it turns out the way you put yourself here is really important for whether you recycle, reduce your carbon footprint, volunteer for environmental causes, and of course, how you're going to vote. And these aren't just single papers here. These are meta-analyses that are showing that when people feel more connected to nature, they do more to protect it. So we see now a really deep leverage point between those kind of worldviews of kinship and protecting the environment. And actually seeing nature as an asset and psychologically distancing ourselves from it. You know, yes, it's a tool in the box, but is it actually at some level creating a sense of distance from nature, which, you know, further reduces our pro-environmental attitudes and behavior? So at this point in the talk, I was going to say, have a look outside at the streets of Oxford, but there's no windows in this room. So have a think now about what the streets of Oxford could look like, okay, if we were to restore nature, and be wild in your vision. I mean, you know, imagine if the streets didn't have any cars, they were grass, you know, and we had trees leaning out of all the buildings and birds flying between the trees. You know, that type of environment, evidence shows that if we spend time in it, doing things where we connect to nature, you know, mindfulness activities, bird watching, photography, painting, that we have a broader sense of identity and we feel more connected to nature. And then, as I said, we do that. We have those pro-environmental behaviors. So it's a virtuous cycle, because then you vote more for nature, you restore nature, you spend your time looking after nature, you recycle more, then we get more nature. This is lovely. Singapore is maybe a nice example of a city that's really trying to put this into play. But of course, the other side of these feedback cycles are sort of vicious cycles where, you know, we have loss of nature. People feel more atomized sense of identity. They feel like they're a discrete sense of self lost and adrift in the world. It leads to mental health problems, strong evidence there, but it also leads to less pro-environmental behavior and less nature. And I'd argue actually that our modern societies have been stuck in this vicious cycle for maybe, you know, a few decades now. So this paper, if you're interested, it talks about this, not just at the personal level, which is like the example I've given, you know, helping in nature restoration, leading individuals to feel more connected to nature, but the institutional level. And when we degrade nature and we get these shocks, you know, whether they're food crises or extreme weather events, those cause changes at identity at group levels. So we get a retrenchment towards nationalism, where we feel like we have to, you know, we feel insecure, and we go towards populist leaders. We elect strongman leaders. Lots of evidence shows this, that when people feel insecure, they go for very right-wing kind of authoritarian strongman type leaders. And it's probably an evolved response when we lived in tribes, because if your tribe's threatened, why not pick a big brute to protect you? It doesn't work in a globalized world where the problems we face are quite wicked problems. They're transboundary problems. And actually, you need to be quite a good systems thinker, probably more of a sort of feminine thinking style, if anything, than your kind of very sort of conservative right-wing mindset. So we get these maladaptive approach impacts that lead us into further vicious cycles. So anyway, I won't go too much on, but if you're interested, that paper talks about this. So I hope I'm not depressing you too much at this point. I'm going to move into a little bit of positive thinking for the last quarter of an hour. So what's positive, I guess, is that lots of different science policy organizations are now thinking about this kind of inner change. It's not the kind of domain of, you know, people wearing flowery shirts from California. It's, you know, this is people, you know, working at these, you know, the UN Assembly, IPCC. So if we do, I'll just read a couple of these, including paradigms. So a fundamental system-wide transformation across technological, economic, and social factors. So it's not excluding the economic and technological, but it's saying including paradigms, goals, and values. And that's what's needed to reverse these trends. And this is a nice one from IPBEST. Pathways to sustainability will require shifts from broad values of individualism and economic profit to sustainability-aligned values of collectivism, care, and equality. So this is really interesting that these, you know, bodies now are talking about these cultural leverage points. And there's some really great reports out there that, you know, deep ecology, for example, where we talk about that connection to nature, you know, also many indigenous, you know, cultures talk about that, but from a Western perspective, it's perhaps deep ecology you might go to, or spiritual traditions as well. But the European Environment Agency have written a report, which essentially is like a deep ecology report, talking about how we need to think about our human relationship with nature. And this is a JRC report, Joint Research Centre report that I was involved in as well. So lots of positive things. These are evidence synthesis of lots of different papers that make the case for this kind of inner change for sustainability. So you've got something commissioned by the Club of Rome, you've got something by the UK Mindfulness Initiative, but focusing on the climate crisis, and you've got something by the UN Development Programme called the Conscious Food System Alliance. So reviewing evidence about kind of deeper leverage points for how we transform food systems, something I kind of talked about already. So these are kind of evidence reviews in their own right. So there's lots of evidence out there that we need this inner change. So the question is, how do we do it? And how do we do it in an evidence-based way? So there's lots of different fields here. So taking people outdoor in nature so they feel more connected, psychedelic interventions, just one-off interventions can have a big effect on how we frame and our perspective on the world and our sense of being a kind of isolated ego versus something that's much more connected to nature. Meditation approaches scientifically shown to change the way our brain is structured. And now there are kind of technological additions to that with neurofeedback. So you can understand, you can hear, get feedback on when your mind is entering a certain state. So you can learn a lot quicker than spending, 10,000 hours meditating. Computer games and virtual reality, there's evidence that these can help perspective taking and change the way we see ourselves in relation to nature. So they can help with things like empathy, but they can also help things like nature connection. Augmenting reality, so we can hear things that we wouldn't normally hear, especially if we're impaired visually or auditory, deaf, then these can be really important. And cognitive interventions. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about an example of one of those. So we're getting even deeper now into the philosophy and the spirituality. I hope I'm not going too much on a Friday afternoon. But this question of who am I is fundamentally important to the whole endeavor of addressing that polycrisis. Okay. So, we can think of our physical bodies. We're all sat here, on our seats. We feel that. We can take a deep breath. And you probably know that, your body contains many microbes, 37 trillion human cells and 38 trillion bacterial cells in your body. And those bacterial cells, they're on our skin, they're in our elbow joints, 440 species, 1,000 species in our mouths, 125 species of bacteria behind our ears, depending on how often we wash. They're in our microbiome, they're in our guts. So that microbiome affects the way we think and it affects our moods. So again, it detracts from our supposed individual autonomy. And our body is made of, cells that are with us just for many occasions, like our gut cells and our skin cells, just for several days or just a couple of weeks. So our body is this continual turnover of material. Many cells are not even human. Even our human cells actually have these mitochondria inside them, of course, which came from protobacteria that was enveloped by another cell, and that became the progenitor of kind of eukaryotic life. So we are a chimera of human and bacterial cells anyway. So, okay, our body right now is not, really anything that defines us as an independent, isolated entity that our education systems or our governments might tell us that we are. So, okay, what about our DNA then? But actually our DNA, DNA builds that body. It's the instructions, material scavenged from the environment to build a body that looks like me. So it's the DNA inside. But actually that's just borrowed from our ancestors and we'll pass it on to our ancestors to come. And those genes travel horizontally across the web of life as well, not just vectored vertically. So, our DNA is actually, we are a kind of cut and paste of genetic code, 30% similar to a bacteria, 99% similar to each other. So it's not really our DNA that defines us or our bodies. But then you can say, well, okay, what about our minds? Because of course that defines me. I decide what I want to do. And that's what defines me right here now. But every word that we hear today, every touch with our loved ones and our friends, even every smell changes the neural networks in our brains, and it really changes who we are, how we think, and in the longer term, our personality. So even smells that go below the radar, there are pheromones that can affect our sense of fear or promote a sense of happiness. So there's experiments where they put these T-shirts, someone in a fearful situation, like throwing them out of an aeroplane, and then you take those t-shirts, okay, with a parachute, take the t-shirt, and then you put someone in a situation that's sweating but not fearful, like in a gym listening to some nice jazz music. So you take the two t-shirts and you put them on mannequins of the kind that dentists practice their surgery on. Okay, and the dentists make more mistakes when they're exposed to the pheromones of the fear treatment. So you can't smell the difference. They both smell mildly sweaty, but they're responding to those pheromones. And actually, well-being pheromones, happiness, also spreads below the conscious radar as well. So our brains, those 170 billion neurons in our heads, are changing all the time in response to those signals from each other, but also from nature as well. Okay? And actually, experiments in mammals show that up to 250,000 new connections are being formed or lost every second. So imagine that your brain is literally shimmering and being changed by everything that we're doing to each other and everything that we hear outside. So even though you might not notice it, if your streets are full of nature, they're changing, who you are and the way you think. Social networks, of course, as well. You've probably read books about social networks or articles. We're affected by and we influence people who we've never even met up to 3 links away. So our taste in music, our voting preferences, our risk of obesity are affected by people we've never even met, or we're being affected by them through these networks. And just to give one last example, in Western kind of mythology, we have this idea that there's these inventors are kind of lone wolves, they're geniuses that kind of work in their little shed. But actually all these things were invented by multiple people at the same time. So the telephone was, it was Graham Bell, wasn't it? But actually there was patent for a telephone on the same day in a different country. And the light bulb was invented at least 20 times independently. So, okay, great as these minds are, they're not really fully independent. And to be fair, if it wasn't them, it would be someone else pretty shortly after. So there's a whole kind of river of culture, of knowledge that's just flowing and is ready to birth these innovations. And that, it breaks down this idea that we're separate individuals. And of course, we're not separate from each other and we're not separate from nature. So whether it's our physical bodies or whether it's our minds, we're deeply connected to that world around us. So I put together, as Yadvinder said, a book on this. And I really enjoyed putting it together, pulling together insights from different disciplines, from chemistry, from neurobiology, from psychology, and even religions like Buddhism and Taoism. And, you can come up with these kind of factoids. But the question I had is, as a scientist, why does it matter? Because when I wrote this book, what I wanted to do was each chapter was tried to be like a little painting that changed the way people see themselves and make them feel more connected. So what I did is I had a survey, because there are a number of surveys, as I mentioned, that you can assess how connected people feel. So you could scan a QR code that was in the cover of the book, and then you could say, how connected to nature are you on this NR10 scale, nature relatedness 10. There are many different of these metrics. They all do much the same thing. And you could see from before and after reading the book, there's a small shift, about an 8% shift in your connection to nature. So that's nice. It's kind of evidence-based that reading the book does something. I don't know how long it lasts. Maybe, maybe it diminishes after a while. Maybe you need to read another book or another, you need to do something else. But we start seeing here how you can unpick an intervention and make it evidence-based. And all these interventions we can do in a similar way. We can think of ways to measure our mindset in certain aspects. None of them are perfect. You can't measure everything, but you can get indicators on whether we're moving in the right direction. They're always going to be proxies. But we can think in evidence-based ways, these different things. And interestingly, we've started this new grant, which is trying to review these different areas, but also think about how we could put them together in a kind of evidence-based developmental program. And then we're not going to do this. I mean, it's very hard to get psychedelic trials in the UK, but things are changing around the world. But there are things already, RSPB have their Connecting to Nature, where they take kids out over 30 days, or 30 days is the Wildlife Trust, 24 days is the RSPB. But what if you combine that with reading, not just non-fiction, but fiction books, which really are known to shift our perspective? What if you combined it with mindfulness approaches and different, technology-enhanced approaches? And can we measure how well that shifts mindsets and start to refine that program? And then you could use that program to, work with different influential people or even children who are going to become influential people and really start to change the way we see ourselves and the way these systems can work and what they're for. So just to start to kind of wrap up, at the turn of the hour. The thought experiment. I asked you, what the future would be like in 2100. And I wanted to, did you think about what it will look like in terms of our buildings, in terms of the way we travel, in terms of the technologies we use to communicate? I wondered how many people kind of also thought about the way we think and our values, and how future people might think differently, or actually even be a different type of people. I mean, if you're anything like me, you probably would have focused on the technological side of things, but actually, rather than just focusing on what humans are doing, what about the way humans are being? And actually, predicting technology is very difficult. The chairman of IBM famously said there'll only be space demand in the world for 5 computers. Right? He was very wrong. Lord Kelvin, the physicist, said heavier than air flying machines are impossible. He was proven pretty wrong. And you couldn't predict smartphones in terms of the impacts, the way they've transformed our lives. And in fact, we still don't really get at how they're changing our minds and the way they're affecting our minds. Again, maybe that's a bit of that myopia, that we're seeing them as a technology and not as a way that of actually changing the way we think. But anyway, it's hard to predict technology, but maybe it's slightly easier to predict culture, because culture's changed slower. The seeds, nothing comes from just nowhere. It comes from something that's from before. So the seeds of the future exist in some germinal form now. And just like tending a garden, perhaps we can choose to nurture a particular type of character or traits that will bring forth a future that has, is better for the planet, is better for nature, better for society. So we don't need to predict the future of human culture. We can choose it. And so I guess a challenge to mull over maybe during the weekend is, can you identify those seedlings and nurture them in your own life, and how we would influence other people in terms of nurturing those kind of seedlings of a different culture. So my last slide, I guess, to kind of summarize, I've talked about, and I'm bringing this down to this kind of Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery now. And you guys do some absolutely great stuff. And my sort of friendly challenge would be to move beyond the kind of framing of nature-based solutions as being things out there, changing the way we, landscapes look to improve, reduce flooding, improve pollination. But actually, how do you do that? And maybe thinking about human nature-based solutions, and maybe moving away from nature recovery, but thinking about human nature recovery as well, because the two are intrinsically linked. You can't have one without the other. I hope I've convinced you. And, this girl might be the CEO of, a major multinational corporation. She might be the next prime minister. So how impactful to think about challenging the way, children think and see themselves in relation to the world. And actually, enabling these changes in the world out there requires that inner change. So I'll end there, just say thank you. I hope there's some good discussion. And, if we don't get to chat, feel free to email. It's t.oliver@reading.ac.uk. And yeah, it was always nice to get feedback and hear also reading recommendations or anything like that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. A wonderful range of materials and lots to think about. Just speaking to your last slide, over the last 2 years, we've been thinking about the definition of nature recovery. And the definition that we settled on was centered on that is repairing human relationships with the rest of the natural world. So the human and the rest of nature is a core part of what we think is a definition of nature recovery.
Oh, that's great. So, you're ahead of me. Yeah. Super.
And one thing I was very struck in your talk is this point of what are universities for? Are they for educating people to be successful business people or paper writing machines or whatever, or is it about creating disruptors? And I really resonated with that idea. And I think your talk today is a nice example, I think, of what contributing to the disruption of the system rather than propagating systems as they are. So,
thank you.
Thank
you
for that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I actually just very quickly, we've discussed of this a bit at Reading about how there's a real risk that we just produce students who then go into the system and become molded by the system. In fact, we prepare them for the workforce. That's the idea, I suppose, isn't it? But there's the danger if the system is flawed, and we know it is, do we want to prepare them to enter that system, and or do we want to create these disruptors? And I think it's not just in environmental science, it's whether they go into business or law or art or film and theatre. There are ways to always lean in to the sustainability kind of challenge, and I think that's what would be great to do, is create those disruptors in a university.
Great. Okay, well, we'll open up to questions from the floor then. So Wendy, do you want to kick off? Oh, this is for the online, so to speak.
Thanks, Tom, for your exciting talk. I'm the Nature and Wellbeing postdoc, just started 2 weeks ago, and
Cool.
head at the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery. So I just feel like after hearing your talk, that's amazing. It's really a good exercise for our brains on a Friday afternoon. So it's very exciting. But I do have 2 questions you kindly mentioned. We're all talking about systematic thinking these days, especially in the decision making to influence the policy makings in the reality level, like on the practical level. And they are systems, or they are strategies that are existing, like by BNG biodiversity net games, or the local nature recovery strategies. They are strategies and systems, and the system trying to break its own silos over there. But then the systematic thinking for us is that there's already existing systems that doesn't really work as it's supposed to be. So it's that we add something more on the current system, or it's like we actually need a new system. Because when we're talking about the things, like a very good example on the BNG, when we talk about your case studies, and then heads on the other side, the extreme case studies in the Lake District, where they have really high value. Every land is really high value in a biodiversity net game. So over there, for them, the environment is almost like a constraint to extent no development is allowed, because all the value here, all the biodiversity value is too high. We can't really find somewhere else to kind of make it up for what we're going to lose here. So that's kind of like 2 sides over there, and it always go back to, it would be good if we have some new strategies. Or what is the way to look for? Is it going to be a perfect solutions on the current things? And sorry, that's the first question. And the second question is, like, you kindly mentioned the social cultural value about, like, for instance, the nature. But then at the very end, for the connectiveness, I saw all the measurements. I mean, we can have collected all the data from your connected nature, clinical samples from the human, but then that cultural social value, like indigenous people saying what a green space means a lot to them, that it's like, how does that going to be reflected in our study? How do we going to capture that when we're studying the connections to nature? So I'm curious about these 2 points.
Thank you very much. So two kind of big questions. I guess I'll just reflect on the first one. I often struggle with this myself, the balance between kind of incremental initiatives towards sustainability versus kind of bigger, what you might call a step change. And I don't know, sometimes the sort of 3 horizon thinking is helpful, where some people work at the sort of 3rd horizon, saying, well, what are the big things we need to do to get to some very different state? And other people are much more sort of focused on the moment, especially people in policy or business or management. They're often thinking of horizon 1 about, okay, what can I do now pragmatically to improve things a little bit? And biodiversity net gain, or green social prescribing, where we take people out in nature to get health benefits, are all kind of examples of good things to do at that earlier horizon. And that's fine. We work at different levels. We definitely have to be careful of just the incremental fixes, where for example, businesses getting reducing their carbon footprint or reducing their biodiversity impact. Everyone's sort of giving them a clapping for saying great. But the reality is, how long will it take to get to be genuinely nature positive or genuinely net zero? And sometimes the reality is they'll never get there in the next 50 years. And obviously we're facing this huge crisis. So we have to be cautious of too much incrementalism, or even greenwashing, where companies pretend they're making progress, but actually they're not really changing much. But so I think, there's a role for everything in terms of those steps, and there's a tension often. And I think we need people who are ambitious and idealistic and visionary, but equally we need pragmatism as well. Also, it's not, thinking about transforming systems, it's not just about the new things. Sometimes it's about scaling down the old things and those incumbent powers, or, perverse, subsidies or whatever. And how do we challenge those vested interests? So I think there's important elements of that. And actually, the European Environment Agency do a great bit of work on systems transitions, and both in terms of how we focus on the new things, but also scaling out the old things. And I've forgotten your second question already, I think. Yeah, the measuring. Yeah. Well, I guess not everything that counts can be counted. I think it was probably Einstein, someone that said that, and it's true. Of course, we're not trying to say that everything can be analysed and quantified. And I'm the first to push back against some of those things. Like it feels odd to monetize biodiversity, but I also would accept that in some cases it's valuable. And so I think we have to be nuanced in our interpretation. We have to realize there are things that about deeper cultural change that we can never measure that are still valuable. And how do we hold that, but also convince people who like to see numbers and evidence? And I think there is ways we can bridge that without being too much one side or the other. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, Tom. It was really really interesting and stimulating. I was wondering, because you mentioned the Technfixes and you caution us against them, but how does that align with your final list of getting us more connected to nature? How does virtual reality differ from little bee-like drones? And I appreciate that. I mean, I can recognize a lot of tree species because 20 years ago I played Farmville as a little game on Facebook, and I now know what a jacaranda looks like. Yeah. But it is a bit sad to learn trees that way rather than just going out and doing that. So I was wondering if you have a bit of a cognitive dissonance on a personal level, yeah. if that's something you're happy with, or just kind of a reality that you're trying to fix your idea onto. And another aspect is, have you looked at marketing techniques? Like in marketing, people would create certain personas of users or agents or actors or stakeholders and say, okay, well, we've got the farmer, we've got the environmentalist. What motivates them? What are their values? How can we approach them? Have you tried this sort of approach?
Yeah, okay, no, it's two good questions. So I guess on the technology side, I think it's important, to try and remember the nuance in the sense that we're not saying that technology or economic fixes are not part of the solution. They certainly are, but they need to be more transformative changes. And coming, to the point about how we connect with nature, we might use technology. Now, I'd be cautious if someone said, well, the only way is to put on a VR headset and pretend you're in nature, and then we allow nature to just be destroyed outside. I mean, that'd be so soul destroying and sad. So absolutely not just focusing on the technology, but equally, I wouldn't say that technology doesn't have a role. Like, many people live in highly urbanized places, and actually, let's say just even a more gentle form of technology, watching documentaries, it's shown to slightly increase people's sense of connection to nature and their motivation to act. So it can be valuable. And VR maybe even more, changing the way, more emotive and a more powerful experience. But I think it's, again, just part of the solution. And you give an example of IDing trees, and these apps that you can go out and just point it at a plan and it tells you what it is. So if those crowd in and a kind of interest, a motivation to be out in nature, then that's great. If people spend more time, they become so gamified that they're just playing the app inside, it's obviously got a bit perverse. So I think it's all these things. We can't be anti-technology or kind of Luddite. And obviously, talking about your kind of marketing approach, if we do that and we see ourselves as too much kind of going back to the woods, many parts of society will see us as not credible. So I think, and on that marketing approach, you're completely right. And we just talked about this today, actually, a couple of people, about how there are ways that we can think about the messaging of these issues. And I also struggled, actually, a bit more philosophical point. If we're trying to change people's values, that's quite a dangerous way, say, for a government to think. You go to a government and say, we want you to start changing people's mindsets. And actually, Western governments have said, no, we don't want to be a nano state. We're just hands off. The trouble with that is, the media is changing mindsets all the time, education system, etc. So You could go the other way, though, to, you know, communism or the Chinese culturally re-educating Uyghur Muslims. And it's that sort of brainwashing side of manipulating mindsets, which obviously is hugely ethically problematic. So I've often wondered myself, and in that safe operating space paper, I talked about the ethics needed in terms of how do you think about this and frame it. And I think I'm coming down on the idea that it's about psychological development. And you're not saying this is how you should be, but we're challenging existing worldviews and saying, well, look, this is actually leading to a system which is ecocidal. So are there other ways to think about it? And you don't have to say how you should think, but you might challenge people. And I think, you know, we've had this vacuum of kind of psychological and moral spiritual development in the West, I would argue, with the retreat of religion. And I'm not saying bring back religion, but maybe there is an approach for these kind of, you know, ways that we can help people, you know, explore themselves, you know, psychologically develop. And I think that a more agnostic framing is perhaps a healthier way of doing it, saying, rather than saying, we're going to tell you how to think, which obviously is problematic.
Seems to me it's almost like recognizing there is a system of norms that are invisible because we just accept them as what they are, and, you know, making people aware that there are assumptions of how the way we work in the world. That opens up the possibility for alternative values coming.
So yeah, I guess I'm interested in how like what this means in terms of your like maybe just scaling it down to like a more individual level. Like I guess I'm asking you specifically, what does this mean for how you like practice with someone with an ecological background, like ecological research background, I guess in the context of doing like, or just more generally doing conservation work, doing ecological research, what does this kind of thinking, what are the implications for how you would carry that out, I guess?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's, yeah, this type of approach talks to the kind of, yeah, not just being kind of abstract about these things, but actually kind of embodying or trying to, you know, more kind of live some of the things you're saying, I suppose. So, you know, of course, I spend time trying to, you know, be in nature and connect to nature in different ways. And in terms of a research perspective, which I think you were kind of getting at more, I think as I indicated at the start, I've kind of shifted how I do my research. Now, I think it's easy sometimes for, as you get to like a level in academia where you've got tenure, or, you know, you can be more comfortable in saying, well, I got to the position where I got to a level where I've got paid enough now that I've got a secure job and I've got a family. Now I have the luxury to do things that are a bit less, you know, productive in terms of high profile journal papers, perhaps, or grants. So I fully understand that, because there is a sort of system at play, and you can jump into that system and try and win and kind of fold yourself into that system, which is kind of soul destroying. And I'm always I always believe that if you want to change the system, you kind of got to be part of it. So you've got to have one foot inside the system and one foot outside. So I've always done that with my sort of science policy work, and try to do it with my academic work. So I still have, you know, work that's on sort of standard ecology, but increasingly I'm working at this sort of interdisciplinary kind of interface, I suppose, and grants as well. I suppose I'm still not at the point where I'm winning more money to do this kind of thing that I actually love and feel is, you know, vocationally more important. I'm still, you know, probably winning more money doing traditional grants, which I actually feel are not really going to change the world that much, if I'm honest. So that's quite sad, doing things that you don't, you know, you're just turning the handle. But so there's a bit of playing the game, because if you don't, you know, play the game at all, you won't perform in a university setting, and you won't have the, you know, the kind of luxury of being able to work on these things. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think it's yeah, I'm sure it'd be interesting to hear people's perspectives on this with a glass of wine, maybe. Or, yeah.
I'll take a couple from online. One from Kim Paul Green. What do you think we should do with key stage 4 and 5 school students to help them both with systems thinking and seeing themselves as part of nature?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that education system is what I maybe call one of these super leverage points for change, because, you know, I talked about leverage points, and I think there are certain areas that we can really target our effort, and we can't do everything. And so I guess this comes a little bit back to the previous question. I've tried to sort of target my effort at leverage points around financial systems, and I know others here do that as well. I think, but a big leverage point is around the kind of economic system the education system as well. And it's something I'm personally less involved in, but of course, how we educate our children will massively affect how our systems look in the future. So I think, I can't come up with an exact answer, but I know there are some, worrying trends around less outdoor education because of the constraints that school faces and child safeguarding regulations, etc., that mean that many schools do less of those field trips, etc. There are, the ideas of GCSEs in natural history, etc. I think there's lots that we could, be unpacked, and I just agree it's important. And I'm not an education expert, but many people, work in that field, and I think there's definitely a danger that, the focus on, say, maths and science, technology, engineering, medicine is not creating rounded individuals. I mean, a lot of the things I've talked about today require integrating kind of a science-based perspective. It's about evidence, but also it's about humanities. It's about ethics, philosophy, morality, art, literature. So I think it's bringing those elements together and to create rounded approaches, and we don't really do that enough. I think we maybe specialize in our systems too much. So it's not easy to solve, but I'd agree with the question of its important focus.
I'll take one more from online, from Jenny Harper. What are your views on the rights of nature movement and the ideas of a sense of new animism, seeing nature as being sentient? And
okay, now that's a great question. And actually, I was just struggling my brain. I was thinking, what is the third super leverage point? Because I have three that I think are very important. One of them is the legal aspects. And so the rights of nature movement is where we give personhood rights to, rivers or woodlands or mountains, in the sense that we can then protect them better. So I think that's quite interesting because it's an approach that's, brought from indigenous cultures in many cases, or helping them to represent their values, their intrinsic values of those ecosystems. And I think it has some merits. The problem is it perhaps is working through, and this comes back to the question of incrementalism, it's working through a westernized legal system. So we're saying this river as an entity has rights. And if we extend that too far, we say, well, this tree has rights, this clump of grass has rights, this ant colony has rights. How do I mow my lawn? And all these competing rights suddenly become this kind of mire of a legal framework. And how would we actually trade those off against each other? Again, it becomes unpracticable. So I think there's the idea of entities, of sovereign entities that have sovereign rights is problematic. And actually, when I was speaking to some of these activist lawyers, they were saying, well, in the 70s and 80s, there was this kind of crossroads at law, and there was a framing of law representing relationships and networks and ecosystems, for example, or a framing of law focused on rights-based approaches. And they went down that framing, and the law system developed. But I do think it might again need a more systemic reframing, redesign, before it can become really valuable practically. That said, I do think it's really great, and I've been involved in the sort of developing UK rights of nature movement, which is a kind of network of coalition of the willing of people interested in these approaches, because I think it does help people think differently about nature. So, nature has rights, not just, something that's there for us. And so I think it helps to shift that Overton window. So even if it's a stepping stone, which I believe it is, I think it's a valuable kind of stepping stone, as long as we don't get kind of fixated on that as a sort of silver bullet solution. Yeah.
Right, thank you. I think we'll wrap up now. But just to conclude, I think from my perspective, a lot of us and researchers and students and others, we wrestle with how our personal value system fits into our planetary values in the system, how much we work with the system, and often what we do is conveniently park our values in a little private space and have this public space which might be informed by our values, but we don't make our values explicit. And I think wrestling through those levels of connection is something that I think your talk has helps elicit some of the challenges and our opportunities we face there.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
Looking forward to talk about that. But thank you very much, and come and join us for drink breakfast.